Tamara, it's great to see you.
Great to be here, Joy. Thanks for having me.
Well, I appreciate you carving out some time, especially during XeroCon. I know you're quite busy at the conference. I heard there's a lot of great energy at the show. We certainly want to talk a little bit about the conference, but I also wanted to pull back the camera a little bit and talk a little bit about your career and your background. When did you begin your career and focus it specifically on sustainability in terms of that market sector or that area of interest?
Yeah, look, there's a pretty big gap between when I began my career and when I started working in sustainability. I did quite a few other things first, but I think the common thread was that everything that I had been working in, I was always interested in change and always interested in how do you make the world a better place than where you found it. I tried a few different avenues to pursue that, and I found myself living in New Caledonia, which is a small island in the Pacific, which is part of France, and working for a large international mining company and taking care of a whole lot of different types of reporting, including sustainability reporting.
Mhm.
And when you work on a mining site, your what we call in sustainability social license to operate is really something that you can't ignore, because if people who live in the surrounding areas are not happy with the way you're treating the environment or the jobs that you're providing, they literally blockade your site and you can't work, which is quite an introduction to the field. And
Right.
I really sort of, when I started working in sustainability, I sort of felt like I'd come home, like I'd found my place, I'd found my people. It was like, oh, this is what I've been looking for, somewhere where I can do intellectually interesting work, but I can also feel like I'm really making a difference.
Got it. Okay. All right. Now, I don't know this for sure. I'm brainstorming on the spot. Now, I'm trying to figure out when you did the mining, did that involve like Perth, Australia at all? Because I noticed in your career you also worked at Telstra, which, the big IT service provider and the communication service provider, also Australia, I believe. Can you connect the dots for me? How do you go from
So,
mining to services or IT services?
yeah, so I lived in New Caledonia for 9 years, and then I needed to come back to Australia, and I was looking for a role. And if you like, I stayed in the sustainability space, but I changed sectors. So Telstra is really a large infrastructure company. It's the legacy telecommunications provider in Australia. And yeah, they were looking for someone to join their team to do sustainability reporting, which is what I'd been doing, among other things, in the mining site. So um, yeah, that was a shift across to a different sector. And I had the fantastic opportunity of being there at a time where Telstra was really transitioning from just being a telco to really being a tech co as well,
Mhm.
and investing really heavily in a lot of tech spaces. I worked, for example, on designing Telstra's responsible AI guidelines, and a lot around that sort of space around the responsible use of tech. And that was, a terrific opportunity to learn something new. I think I'm always interested in jobs where I can learn something.
Yeah.
And, it was taking a skill set that I already had, but applying it to a sector that was quite different.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, super interesting that you were on or focused on responsible AI long before most of us. I want to put this in context. You and I are speaking in August of 2024, and yes, a lot of people are thinking about responsible AI now. But when you were at Telstra, this is pre-2021, give or take, and you were already focused on responsible AI conversations at that point, huh?
Yeah, and I mean, we weren't talking about Gen AI back then. We
Mhm.
were really talking about automated decision making,
Right.
and how do we in that context, we were talking about how do we make sure that when we employ automated decision making technologies, we're not, for example, replicating biases that might
Mhm.
discriminate against certain customer groups, that we're not using customers' information and data in ways that they didn't intend for it to be used when they agreed to share it with us. And actually, one of the things that attracted me to Xero when I was looking at new roles was that they already had a responsible data use set of commitments in market, back in 2021 as well.
Mhm.
And I thought, okay, so here's a company that's thinking about things in the same way that I have been.
Gotcha. Yeah. Now let's connect the dots. So Telstra, in terms of my background as a journalist, I covered the company, to your point, as it moved from telco services into technology services. I covered quite a few of their MSP acquisitions in the managed service provider sector. And then I continue to watch that company from afar, but then I started covering sustainability, and I've heard about some of Xero's efforts there. I believe you joined Xero around the 2021 timeframe. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like to move from sort of a telco and an IT service provider to a SaaS company, and how that all came together in terms of sustainability focus?
Yeah, look, I mean, I was looking for something new and something a bit different to do, and I'd say that the biggest difference between the two companies was not so much not so much the sector as the maturity of the organisation. I mean,
Mm,
Telstra is more than 100 years old. It's a big legacy organisation in Australia with really mature systems and processes internally. It was formerly a government-owned business. And Xero is the same age as my oldest child, is 18 years old, and really felt like when I joined Xero, we were still very much an adolescent company.
mm,
We'd grown really, really quickly. The market was expecting a lot of us in the sustainability space in terms of processes, disclosures, policies, and we just didn't have that
mm,
because the company had grown so quickly that we hadn't been focused on doing that sort of basic, what I call ESG hygiene work. And when Xero was looking for someone, they were really looking for someone who could come in and provide that structure and provide, building the architecture that's necessary to underpin good sustainability work, which is often, as I say to my team at Xero, it's often not as sexy as some of the other stuff that you get to do. But if you haven't done it and you don't get it right as the sort of foundational underpinning of your sustainability program, then you can't really do anything on top of it. I spent a lot of time in my first few years at Xero really just building out that sort of policy and process architecture and bringing stakeholders on a journey where they understood what we are trying to do and why it matters.
mhm. Got it. Now, I think that was the 2021 timeframe, that you joined, and then by what amazed me is by 2022, I think by fiscal year 2022, the company had announced some of its targets across scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Um, was how did you have to herd cats, so to speak, in terms of getting all the departments lined up behind that? How do you begin to build that foundational structure, as you say?
Look, I think a lot of it, and I say this to my team all the time as well, a lot of it is about building human relationships. You've got to build relationships with people where they understand that you're there to be a partner and help them rather than coming with a big stick. Understanding what the challenges are for them in helping you to achieve these goals. Because in sustainability, a lot of the time you're asking busy people to do things on top of their day job with resources that they don't necessarily have and budget that they don't necessarily have. So you're sort of saying to them, this is the kind of bigger picture and this is why we need to do this. In Australia, if you like, the regulatory environment really shifted in 2022, and the organisation that Xero had been using and still uses to this day to certify carbon neutrality, Climate Active, required companies who wanted to remain certified to introduce targets, which was
Mm,
kind of the impetus for moving at speed. But then, working with the organisation and helping people to understand that, they weren't alone in the things that we were asking them to do to help us move towards those targets. But that, as I sort of put it quite bluntly, when one of the board members asked me, do we really have to do all these things? And I said, well, look, if you're asking me, can we stay the same and do nothing and reduce our emissions? The answer is no. That's just how the world works. Like, everyone has to make changes. So it was really about finding the changes that were going to be sensible and that were going to work in our organisation. And as you know, if you're working in the sustainability space, when you're a SaaS company, most of your emissions come from what we call scope 3. So that's things that you don't control yourself
mm.
in the main, and that's really challenging. I don't think we can't back away from the fact that that's difficult to get commitment to make changes in things that you don't control.
Yeah, yeah. You stole my thunder in terms of the next question, and that's that
Sorry.
focus as a SaaS business. You are a SaaS business. As you think about basically getting scope 3, measuring it, monitoring it, bringing down your scope 3 data points. Have you made progress on that, or at least do you have visibility now on scope three? I mean, how would you describe that process so far, the challenges as well as the potential progress?
Look, I think it's a common challenge for all companies that are tackling scope three, that you don't have enough good data.
Mm,
And I think as you get better data, sometimes you realize that maybe you can't do some of the things you thought you were going to do, or maybe they're not going to have as much impact as you thought they were going to have. And we're actually going through that process at the moment. For fiscal 24, under the various technical guidelines that I don't want to bore your listeners with, but under the technical guidelines that govern the way you report carbon emissions, we were required to change our emissions boundary. So we had to include a whole lot of emissions in our disclosures and in our scope 3 that we'd never included before. And that led to about 160% increase in our scope 3 footprint. So we're going through the process at the moment of
mm,
revisiting all of those targets and rebaselining them at fiscal 24, so we can look at what we can reduce from that new footprint that includes a whole lot of categories of emissions that hadn't been material previously but are now. In terms of the work that we've done, I think a big focus for us in the first instance was making sure that we could get on top of the data internally and do our carbon accounting more accurately
mhm,
on an internal basis. And we're now at the point where we've probably extracted as much information as we can from our internal systems, and we need to work really closely with our suppliers to understand what they're doing and get better data from them about what their emissions profile looks like. Because at the moment, we do what the vast majority of people do, and we use spend-based carbon accounting for scope 3, which means we're just using industry averages.
mhm,
So when our large partners like Google, Microsoft, Amazon make progress towards decarbonising their own operations, that's not reflected in our carbon footprint at the moment because of the way we're doing our carbon accounting. So the next step for us is to really get those actuals
mhm.
and factor them into our carbon accounting, so that the work that they're doing, or the good work they're doing, is actually reflected in our carbon footprint as well.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, are the major cloud service providers making progress in terms of gathering and exposing that data for third parties such
Absolutely.
as you? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And despite the bad press that pretty much all of them are getting at the moment because of the impact of energy intensive large language models and generative AI, they're actually doing some great work and
Mm,
really leaning into, for example, renewable energy, leaning into reduced water consumption for cooling of their data centers. All of our data centers are third party hosted, so we don't actually own any data center infrastructure. So we have to work with them to reduce the energy impact of all of the services that they provide. And when I first started having conversations with them, I was really pleasantly surprised by how ambitious their targets were and how much work their internal teams were doing to, for example, be able to provide even emissions factor by product. So,
mm,
having a conversation with Google about whether they can tell us what the emissions factor or what the emissions associated with, each display advertising unit that we purchase, or each search unit that we purchase from them. And they're, almost there, which
yeah.
is, I think, really encouraging.
Yeah, it really is. And I think the average person doesn't realize just how much renewable energy really is powering a lot of those cloud scale service providers. We've seen the progress as well. We've also seen what you're describing, the Gen AI energy consumption concerns. But you know what? I think it's a new wave, and I think they'll get it under control, hopefully. So, but either way, it sounds like they're making a lot of progress with the data availability.
Look, I mean, I think the first step is you've got to have visibility of it, and you've got to be able to measure it, and then you can move towards how do you reduce it. And look, we can't get away from the fact that Gen AI is energy intensive, but I think we tend to get a bit, well, some people tend to get a bit caught up in the hype around that and not look at the fact that the vast majority of those people who are using Gen AI products in their end use, you or I, if we're using OpenAI or ChatGPT, we're not actually building and hosting large language models.
Right.
We're buying that as a service. And although that service has somewhat higher energy use than some of the other services that we might buy, I think we have to be careful not to descend into a sort of hysteria where people think, every time I use a Gen AI product, I'm killing the planet, because that really isn't the case at the moment.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Now let's talk a little bit about other partners. You mentioned the cloud service providers, but in terms of your partner relationships, on the partner front, I believe there's a company named Sumday, Sumday, Sumday. And I think you partnered probably in the last few months, or maybe it's in the last fiscal year, give or take, on carbon accounting solutions for customers. How did the partnership come about? What's been the progress? What are you hearing from customers on that? What are you hearing from Sumday on that?
So someday are here with us at XeroCon, and yeah, they're a great company that started in Tasmania, which is a little island down the bottom of Australia. No one thinks that you're going to get a startup from Tasmania, and essentially they were accountants who got asked to do carbon accounting and realised there was no good software to do it. So they built this tool, and when I first met Jess Richmond, who's the CEO of Sumday, she said to me, "We want to be the Xero of carbon accounting." And I had a look at their product, and it has the same kind of beautiful interface and look and feel that Xero has. It's really intuitive and really easy to use, but it's also built with accountants and bookkeepers in mind. So it's a very robust product that allows accountants and bookkeepers to produce audit-ready carbon accounts for their customers. And we really think that's where carbon accounting will go and where its natural home is. Most sustainability practitioners don't want to be accountants,
Mm.
whereas most accountants are pretty excited about the idea of doing carbon accounting because it makes a change from what they're doing now. So we're really working with Sumday to sort of spread the word that we think accountants and bookkeepers have a really critical role to play in this space, and that they need to step up and start upskilling in carbon accounting so that they can offer that service
Mm.
to their customers. We do have a second partnership globally, which provides a service or provides carbon accounting capability to customers who would rather do it themselves. And that's with Greenly. And I think you had Alexis Normand, their CEO, on not long
Yeah.
ago, talking about their really successful Series B raise.
Yep.
And that's another fantastic, innovative platform. And we recognise that some customers are going to want to do their carbon accounting themselves or would rather manage that in-house. So we wanted to provide both solutions for customers. So Sumday is really our accounting and bookkeeping preferred partner, and Greenly for our small businesses.
Fantastic, fantastic. Yeah, to give you some background on me, and it's interesting you mentioned the carbon accounting trend and how accountants are becoming carbon accountants. When we launched Sustainable Tech Partner about in mid to early 2023, most of my focus was on IT consulting firms, MSPs, channel partners moving towards sustainability and sustainability services. It wasn't until I started speaking with folks like you and others in the software space where it became clear that so many accountants would move into carbon accounting. Now, that trend, are there certain regions in the world where that trend is ahead of curve in terms of where you're seeing it happen first?
Yeah, look, I think it's really being driven by regulation and legislation. So
Mhm.
the markets where it's currently mandatory or about to become mandatory for large companies to disclose their carbon emissions to an auditable standard is where we're really seeing accountants move into that space. In terms of markets that Xero services, the strongest demand that we're seeing is in the United Kingdom and Australia, and that's led by a regulatory push. But we know that, for example, in the US, even though the SEC regulations are stayed at the moment because of a court challenge, some states are doing it on their own. So we have legislation in California, we have a bill in New York, and we will see large companies required to report under those pieces of legislation, regardless of where they operate in the US.
Yep.
And what we're seeing from a small business point of view is that there's a sort of cascading effect down the supply chain. So you might not personally be captured by the legislation, but if you supply to one of the big companies or you supply to a supplier of one of the big companies, then you're going to be asked for your carbon emissions information. And if eventually, if you can't provide it, then they may find another supplier who can. So what we're trying to help small businesses understand is this if you play in supply chains of large companies, this is not a nice to have. This is something that is going to be as fundamental as doing your tax, and you've got to get on top of it.
Mhm.
And just like you use an accountant to do your tax, talk to your accountant about doing your carbon accounting.
Yep, yep. Well, I tell you what, I agree 120% with your thesis about those smaller businesses, the downstream businesses, and the supply chain interactions. The thing I always bring it back to is I remember when Walmart started mandating, hey, if you want to be on our shelves, you need to support RFID. And everyone in the supply chain started investigating and understanding RFID. I think the same is happening now at carbon accounting. To your point, now you're kind enough to carve out some time for me. You're at a conference, XeroCon. Can you tell us a little bit about the overall conference, and then also, is sustainability a major theme or a hallway conversation? What type of conversations are happening there on the sustainability front?
Yeah, thanks. So XeroCon is our opportunity to connect with the accounting and bookkeeping partners who work with Xero all the time, and for us to help them understand what's coming up in terms of new trends, what's coming up in terms of our product, and also to connect with each other and with us, and sort of have those conversations that help to build understanding about what they're looking for from our product, but also for us to share the trends and things that we're seeing in our space. We have two sustainability specific features in the program this year. Yesterday, on the main stage, we had Steve Cassingham from Sustainable Goat, who you may or may not know, talking about sort of why sustainability matters and how you can take action. And then today I'm on stage with Jess Richmond from Sumday, and we're talking about carbon accounting as a new frontier in compliance,
Mm.
and really talking to accountants and bookkeepers about, regardless of whether you are interested in climate change, this is a revenue stream for your business that you can monetize if you get on top of it, and you upskill in it. And actually, you don't need to be a sustainability specialist to be a good carbon accountant. It's
Mhm.
basically just maths once you understand the underlying principles. And so, don't be scared, take that step and get involved.
Yep. Yeah. And I think that's an important part of the conversation. Lead with the carrot, the business opportunity, rather than the stick, which is always about, oh, compliance mandates are coming, or you're going to have to do this anyway. There really are some great business opportunities here. Now, as we're talking here, it's mid-August 2024. Look ahead to me, 2025-ish. Do you see any next moves or sustainability priorities at Xero that you're gonna really focus in on?
Look, yeah, I mean, we are, as I mentioned, in the process of looking at our climate targets and looking at our current carbon footprint, and we're really thinking outside the box now and saying scope 3 is hard. So what can we do that maybe nobody else has done or nobody else has tried? I don't know how much you know about our CEO, Sukhinder Singh Cassidy, but Sukhinder's very big on helping people to understand that you can take small risks and you can try things and see what might happen from them. So I can't tell you too much more than that now, but we are really looking at some innovative things that we can do in the scope 3 space, because you know I don't want to sort of lay it on too thick, but we are facing into a climate emergency. We do have to do something. And so sitting around just going, it's hard, we don't know what to do, isn't working. So we're sort of thinking, well, let's try some stuff and see whether we can make a difference, see whether we can move the needle on our emissions footprint. And the other thing that Xero is really going to lean into in the next 12 months, that you'll see some news come out about later in the year, is more of the sort of social space that we haven't had a big presence in before.
Mhm.
Where as we mature as a company, we're starting to think more deliberately and thoughtfully about how can we give back, and where does it make sense for us to leverage the skills and expertise in the broader Xero partner community to help uplift sort of groups that are not currently having access to some of those same skills and opportunities. So I'm being deliberately vague because I'm not allowed to talk about any of these things
Vague is
publicly yet.
vague
But
is
maybe we
great.
can
It's a
catch
great
up in
teaser.
maybe we can catch up again in 12 months, Joe, and you can tell me whether we met your expectations or not.
Absolutely. Vague is great. It's a great teaser. It reassures us that you're going to continue experimenting in these areas, and we look forward to hearing more. In the meantime, for a viewer or listener or reader who wants some initial information about what you're up to in sustainability, is there a particular website or URL they should check out?
So on our main Xero page, www.xero.com/sustainability. You'll see lots of information about our sustainability programs, as well as information you can download about our performance.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Joe. It's been great to chat.
This podcast is copyright of Sustainable Tech Partner and Mentori Ventures. Music written, performed, and copyright of my son, also named Joe Panettiere.